Pat Kennedy with Kennedy Sutherland Law Firm, and delighted to be here with my good friends Al Jones, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of American Bank in Corpus Christi, and George Hahn, who is a principal shareholder and the chief visionary for the Subchapter S legislation that we're talking about today. Well, George, you've had a great interest in flow-through tax treatment for many, many years. And would you kind of share your vision about how this whole Subchapter S for banks got started?
During the mid-'80s, Harvey and I had some extensive conversations about what other form of entity could be useful in banking. And I happened to be out of town, but we had a couple-hour conversation and talked about the use of Texas Limited Partnership, maybe the LLC form, and just a wide discussion. And as a result of that, we kicked off an effort to come up with a solution. And it just so happened that Kenton McDonald, who worked with the Branscombe firm at that time, had become an IRS commissioner, assistant to the commissioner, and had worked on a Wyoming LLC plan. And so when Kenton was available, we got into extensive conversations about that aspect of banking, and an outgrowth of that with Al and the board. We started talking in terms of Limited Banking Association in the state of Texas.
We used Kenton's contacts with the service to try to run the traps on what might be feasible for a flow-through taxation kind of an element, and didn't come up. We didn't get very far trying to do something on a national level, and then came up with a pretty unique idea of trying to create what we called a Sub-S lookalike at the state level. And so I'm not even sure where the name came up along the line, but we dreamed up this name that eventually became known as the Texas Limited Banking Association, that was just available. It eventually was approved by the Texas legislature and is actually on the books today. If you wanted to be a Texas LBA, you could do that instead of being an S corp. But it took us about 3 sessions of the Texas legislature to wind its way through to get it finally approved and finally on the books. But it was an effort to wire around the not being able to get it done at a national level. So we decided to try to do it at the state level, and we're successful at that. And when we reached that amount of success, we thought we were home free. But then we either did the right thing or the wrong thing, but we asked for a private letter ruling from the Internal Revenue Service about the tax aspects of the Texas LBA. And Pat, I can't remember for sure, but it seemed like it took us about 2 years or so of back and forth with them, and a lot of foot dragging and a lot of hemming and hawing, and they finally declined our request, and based on their interpretation of the Texas Constitution of 1867 or something. What they really meant was that a banking corporation was per se a C corporation, which was just their way of saying, we don't want you to do that.
Exactly right. Pretty clear that the IRS didn't want banks to be flow-through
at
tax
all.
Treatment entities. But so when we got the negative ruling, that was in September of 1995. We had been having some conversations on a national level, and as you recall, and we had a visit with Chairman Archer from Houston, who was then chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And we suggested to him that there was a way to fix the IRS issue for Texas Limited Banking Associations, or we could go back to the original idea of making it a national event, and we offered a sentence or two of some language to allow banks to elect Subchapter S, and Chairman Archer said, let's do that. I guess it took a little while because the government was shut down through political gridlock, and that was in October of 1995, and I think they finally got back together on a bill in May of the following year, 96. And George, you recall some of the moment-to-moment, last-minute efforts to get the...
Yes, there was discussions going back and forth, and the House Senate Conference Committee was due to be scheduled for a Thursday. Not sure of the date, but on a Thursday, and we were fortunate enough to be able to contact several people involved, and at the very last moment, a banking section of that House Senate conference included a bill concerning Sub-S corporations and various restrictions and or limitations and number of shareholders and other elements of Sub-S. And at the very last moment, a motion was made at that conference, Senate conference, House Conference Committee to include the ability to form an S Corp. And that got passed, and we had S Corps. And it was a evolution of
A lot of work.
a lot of work and a lot of years, and it bore great fruit.
George's idea was that it was going to be extremely positive for community banks, period, which it was, and what it achieved and has achieved on behalf of community banks is to allow the owners of the banks to keep the banks rather than to sell the banks or to merge with somebody in order to monetize their investment. Because back then, banks were kind of limping along and were being acquired and sold, and let me out of this deal because we can't make any money at it. And it added a huge boost to the profitability of banking, community banking, and an attraction for it. So it's a wonderful achievement.
Tremendous benefit nationally. We have, I think, currently 2,300 banks in the U.S., George, that have maintained their Sub-S election, and I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars of assets and family wealth that has been retained and created as a result of that, and helped so many other people in the communities where those banks operate, because they would have gone away, they would have been merged, and they would have been national branches that are not really focused on the community. So needless to say, it's been a great thing for American Bank.
You bet.
Undoubtedly, it has allowed us to really create an environment which I think is one of the most important things for the success of community banks, and that is that you have a fairly small group of shareholders, owners, who really have a very vested interest in the success of the bank, and they have to collaborate with management to be effective in overseeing the bank. And it's just a great collaboration between ownership and management to ensure that community banks do as well as they do. And I think the track record on community banks through several economic cycles has proved itself that some of the S corporation statistics are head and shoulders above other types of ownership.
What's been interesting is that the whole concept continues to evolve. There are unique ways to think about using the election, managing assets, and potentially other legislative developments. And through the years, we've been able to get the shareholder number raised to 100, plus a special, analysis of family
ownership. Yeah.
And hopefully we'll be able to continue to improve what George envisioned.
Well, I think that there's a lot of attractive qualities to the S Corp status, which we elected in the first year possible in 1997. And over the intervening 16 years, I think there's multiple characteristics that we really find preferable versus a C Corp ownership status. And for us, I think over time, what we've learned is that we really do like the flexibility of the S Corp status and how that really fits with what we think the community bank business model should be. So for instance, in good times, the pass-through status on earnings can serve as a safety valve to maybe distribute some excess cash flow rather than pile up those earnings and feel pressure to go out and re-leverage those in a more aggressive fashion. We've never been a grow at all costs type of organization. We're more than happy to find good quality growth when we see it, but we don't want to arbitrarily set a higher than reasonable growth target, because the last 10 years have proven that leads to some real dangerous boom and bust type of behavior. You end up quite frequently with a different type of investor base, one that I think is more closely aligned to the organization. I think S Corps are technically partnerships, and they behave that way in real life. I think that you'll find that they're more tightly knit investor groups quite frequently than other organizations. They have a longer term focus, and also are quite frequently much more local in character than you might find with other types of institutions. And that's good not just for the organization, but for the local community. I clearly remember in the 1990s, prior to the availability of S Corp status for financial institutions, that we felt that we were in danger of compiling some excess earnings that were going to be very hard to redeploy in a fashion that wasn't too risky. And I think the other alternative would have been that we might have had to put the bank on the market for sale. Many S corporations were better prepared going into the financial crisis because they didn't have that really aggressive profile perhaps, and were more closely focused on the local economy, and perhaps had a better insight into where some of the bad behavior might have been leading as the boom built up towards the bust in 2008 and beyond.
Our firm serves the community banking industry. It is virtually the only clientele that we serve. Our firm works with approximately 160 community banks that are located primarily in the western United States in 11 different states. We counted up the number of S Corp banks that we do work for, and the number is 62. Banks first became eligible to be S Corps back, I think it was January 1 of 1997. And since then, I personally have been involved in 12 S elections for my clients. S Corp banks, by and large, seem to be more profitable than their peers. In the area of capital gains, S Corps have a distinct advantage. If an S Corp realizes a capital gain, that gets passed through to their shareholders and gets taxed at the capital gain rate. If an S Corp realizes a capital loss, that too gets passed on to their shareholders, and they'll get to offset it against capital gains in their return or deduct it otherwise. This is as opposed to the handling in a C corporation, where capital gains are taxed at ordinary rates and capital losses are only available to offset capital gains. And all too often I've seen C corps that generate capital losses lose the benefit of those losses. ESOPs have been an interesting pairing with S corps. ESOP shareholders are the only shareholder that are not taxed on their S corp earnings, and so the distributions that are made to the shareholders to help take care of the tax burden are retained by the ESOP and are available for other purposes. So it makes for a great source of cash flow. One of the advantages that have always been perceived for S corps is when they go to sell. An S corp can sell and structure the transaction so that it's an asset sale, so the buyer, if he's paying a premium, gets a step up in basis. That's because there's only one level of taxation for the S corp seller. That's opposed to the situation of a C corp, whereas if they structure a sale as an asset sale, first the corporation pays a tax on the gain on sale, and then there's another layer of taxation when the selling corporation makes a distribution to its shareholders. So the S Corp has a real advantage there. Most of the S Corp banks are not family controlled, but rather have a wider, more diverse shareholder group. For many of my existing C Corp banks, I encourage them to analyze whether or not the S election makes sense for them. Some of those C Corp banks are ineligible, and it's an easy decision, no. They may have too many shareholders, they may have ineligible shareholders, or there might be other factors that otherwise make the S election disagreeable. But for the other ones, they need to analyze it and make an informed decision of, should I make the S election? And if I decide not to, why? Well, I've been involved with the Subchapter S Bank Association for a long time. I know we're coming up on the 16th annual conference. If I wasn't at the first one, I believe I was at the second one. So I'm going to say I've been involved for the last 15 years. I think the Subchapter S Bank Conference is a great resource for S Corporation banks and for those that are considering that election. It's the only conference I know that is specifically focused on the issues related to S Corp banks. I've encouraged my clients to go, and indeed for the many that have gone, virtually all of them do return to subsequent conferences. So it's a great learning opportunity and resource to S Corp banks and those considering it. The past year, I've had two C Corp banks that made their S election effective January 1, 2013. One of those banks has an interesting dynamics. It's owned by 4 siblings, 2 of whom are involved in management, and 2 are absent owners, if you will. And over the years, up till now, the bank has been in a growing mode and traditionally has not paid dividends to the shareholders. Well, now that they have reached a certain maturity level and they're in a dividend-paying mode, the non-manager siblings are looking for cash distributions. But everybody's very much aware of the double taxation, the tax that's paid by the corporation, then the tax that's paid by the individual when they receive the dividends. So for this bank, the S election was just the obvious solution to help them make distributions to their shareholders in the most tax-efficient way possible.
I represent a second generation of banking in Winter Park, Florida. I joined National Bank of Commerce in 1998 and began my career behind the teller line. Subsequently, after a 2-year training program, our bank sold to Wachovia, and I found myself working in the private wealth management group of Wachovia. I soon learned that community banking was in my blood and left Wachovia with the aspirations of starting a community bank, which we formed in 2002 and opened our doors in February of 2003, known as Commerce National Bank of Florida. We organized under the OCC, submitted a federal charter, and applied to the IRS for a Subchapter S designation. In 2006, we applied for trust powers and organized a trust department. We changed our name from Commerce National Bank of Florida to Commerce National Bank and Trust.
Subchapter S charters were not available in 1986 when we started National Bank of Commerce. And we remained a C Corp until we sold to Wachovia in 2001.
We put together a group of investors and chartered ourselves as a Subchapter S organization in 2002.
And we opened under that name in 2003 in the same facility that had previously been our main office here in Winter Park. When we were analyzing the organization of the new bank, we studied the option of a Subchapter S tax status, and we realized it had a lot of merit, and so we pursued that option. We had a group of astute investors that understood the advantages of Subchapter S, and that was eliminating one level of taxation, the corporate tax level. We initially raised $8 million from about 60 shareholders. We're pleased with the Subchapter S status, although at the present time it's not quite the advantage because we're not paying a dividend. Florida is primarily a real estate oriented market, and Florida banks have suffered greater than most states because of that. We're no exception. For the last couple years we've been in a loss, mostly to increases in the allowance. Nevertheless, we continue to be very confident of the recovery, and at some point in time we'll be returning to paying dividends. The last 2 years have been painful for us in that we've had losses primarily associated with the loan loss reserves. Nevertheless, when we return to profitability, our shareholders will have the benefit of the tax loss carry forward obtained during the past 2 years. Being a Subchapter S bank has been a distinct advantage to us, and it's been attractive to investors who see the advantage of being an owner of a locally owned and locally managed community bank that has a long-term outlook.
Many of our customers and shareholders are also Subchapter S business owners, so they understand the tax advantage of being an S corporation, and it's no different in the banking business. But many entrepreneurs that own their own businesses also have the Subchapter S designation, and they see that advantage on a personal tax level, and that is why it's attractive to them to be an owner of our bank.
I see the future of being a Subchapter S charter as being a distinct advantage.
Due to the uncertainty of the federal tax rates, there is going to be a distinct advantage of remaining a Subchapter S organization.
We believe not only today the Subchapter S organization has an advantage, but we think that advantage is even going to be more significant as perhaps federal tax rates increase.